Hi. If you've been following my weekly news updates on Starcom Unknown Space, you'll know that over the past month or so, I've been working on a new version of the content creator tool that I use to author the game's story content. My goal is to get it to the point that players interested in creating their own stories can do so using this tool with minimal coding knowledge. I've never released a tool like this, so it's going to be a bit of an experiment. It's not quite ready for closed beta testing, but I think it will be, quote, soon. When it is ready, I want to have some documentation material explaining how it works so testers can get a basic idea of how to get started and how the various systems relate to each other. This is going to be the first in a series of videos on the tool. First of all, content in the game is organized into what I refer to as stories. These can correspond with individual stories that you'd encounter in game, but they don't have to. Really, a story is a way of organizing related content together and keeping things simple so you aren't trying to find one anomaly out of hundreds or worrying about different mission variables trampling each other. If you come from a programming background, a story is kind of the content equivalent of a namespace or module. And stories consist of regions, missions, anomalies, conversations, items and discoveries, factions, swatches, and ships. For this demo, I've already created a story called CubeQuest. The real purpose of CubeQuest obviously is to demo the tool, but I'm going to proceed exactly the same as if I were creating content for the game. As a first step, I usually write out a short document describing the story in plain English to help organize my thoughts and figure out what the content requirements are. Sometimes I'll also draft out text for the anomalies and conversations here too. In CubeQuest, the player is hailed by Captain Dolson, the commander of the Alethea, who tells them about a new set of gateway coordinates her crew has uncovered. If the player investigates the region, they'll find a series of anomalies guarded by automated stations. On each anomaly is one of 3 artifacts, and once the player has all 3, they will get a discovery and maybe some lore. Okay, let's start by creating a conversation for Commander Dolson. Kick off conversation to start the mission. And we need to set her actor portrait. There she is. And priority is if a character has more than one conversation available at any time that has valid introductory nodes, the one with the highest priority will be shown. And the attract flag only has an effect in the station, so that is the sort of glowing button effect that alerts the player that there's a new conversation. And this field only matters in the context of the Seleno station. So, and because this is a NPC conversation, we want to start with an NPC dialogue. And this is what Commander Dolson says at the start of the conversation. Then we're going to give a group of player responses. You could go straight from the NPC node to the player responses, but for reasons that will be obvious shortly, we're going to have a group above that. That is an organizational node. Okay, and their first player's response is, check it out. And we'll give them a second response where they can ask some follow-up questions. Okay. And then Dolson's response to the player's response. her answer to the player's questions. This is one of the reasons to draft the text in Word. I could just cut and paste them in here, although it's important to remember that sometimes Word introduces some extra characters that don't display correctly in the engine, so be aware of that. Okay, so right now, Captain Dolson introduces the mission, excuse me. Player has 2 possible responses, each of which gives a different response from Dolson. We can test the conversation in the tool. Okay, now you'll notice that at the end of the conversation, the hail communications ends, and maybe we'd like to let the player, ask the other, question, or so if the player asks the question, then they would like to confirm checking it out. But if they just said we'll check it out, then they should not proceed to the question. So the way to do that is with linking. So we're going to link the end of this dialogue back to the group. Okay, so now they ask the question and now can say we'll check it out. But now notice that the same question is also still appearing, which is not ideal. And the way to handle that, or one way to handle that, is by using the one-time flag on the node. So that just means that this node will only ever be shown once throughout the game. And there's an alternate once per conversation node. So for example, if you say only wanted to let the player ask about trading once during a conversation, you could use that one instead. And then test the conversation. And we can see that the second option is no longer available. And incidentally, this linking is why I added this group here, so that there was a node to enter before going on to the player responses. Next up, let's begin the mission logic. Missions are not just things that appear in the player's log, they are all of the underlying invisible logic to the game's story and narrative. So for example, they can be used for ad hoc logic like creating a test mission, so that if you want to test out a mission without having to necessarily play all the steps leading up to it, you can get the game into a particular state using a mission, and so forth. Alright, so let's create our main mission for the story, and we want it to kick off as soon as the player is close to the Alethea. So we're going to add a condition. I happen to know that the persistent ID of the Alethea is that, or at least it is after the Alethea has returned to Seleno. I'll say at most 200, and then we need to add that conversation we just created to the Alethea. There it is. And then we need to hail the player. So let's see. So if we don't want to just test this right away, because the player will just sort of not be starting anywhere. So we need to. That's the reason we created the test mission. Let's see, save our story first. And we're getting an error because I have that folder open elsewhere. Let's try that again. There we go. So we want to go to our test mission. And then we want to activate that mission. We will activate it differently from the bootstrap later, but we'll get to that in a little bit. There's our cube quest, cube mission. Okay. So hopefully... Okay, so through our test setup, we are now here at the starting gateway, and the Alethea should be around here somewhere. Maybe I did something wrong. Oh, is that it? Yep. Okay, now let's see what happens if we hail the Alethea again. Okay, so now notice that she's saying the same conversation again, which we don't want. And to fix that, we could have a second NPC branch here below, like an alternate conversation that she says while this mission is still active, but for the case of this mission, we're just going to set the initial intro to be a one-time, which sort of has the same effect as before when we set the player's response to one time. So this whole conversation now can only happen once. Okay, so going back to our mission, before we test it again, choose the right mission. Let's put the mission in the player's log. Okay, so after our first node, we want a second node, and so this is how, and this is very important to just the whole structure of understanding the flow, is that you have these multiple sequences of nodes. A sequence of nodes is called a lane, and the logic works from left to right so that there's only one node active at a time, and when all conditions are true, the actions are executed, and then the lane advances to the next node. So it's important to think about the flow of the mission and whether or not there are possibilities for scenarios to kind of happen out of the order that you sort of naturally imagine the mission to happen in. And I think that's sort of something that you just sort of have to experience. You have to learn through the process of creating missions and seeing what kind of bugs you run into, and then separating out or organizing the lanes in a way that works. So once the player has seen this conversation, then we want to say this mission is now visible in the log. And it looks a little weird to have just the mission title, so generally you also want to have some sort of detail or goal. In this case, and a goal is something associated with a place in the universe. So, anyway, coordinates. So, as I mentioned earlier, stories are namespaces, and so to unambiguously refer to something that may or may not be in the same storyline, you use story dot and then the name. So, for example, there is going to be, we haven't created it yet, there's going to be a gateway in the new region, and its full ID is cubequest.gateway. And that way the game logic can find it, And so, for example, in the log, when it wants to input these coordinates, it's going to substitute those coordinates in, or at least the human readable version, and that's going to tell it on the map where to look for. And we're going to say it's going to be marked discovered. And actually, now that I'm looking at this, we're missing something. We haven't actually created the region yet, so we're going to have to do that before we can progress much further. Okay, I think that's probably a good place to break for this video, and then in the next one I can pick up and start creating the region for CubeQuest and progress the mission a little bit further. Okay, thanks for watching.